Hi, today I'm going to go over with you Unit 1 review so that you're ready for the test. So feel free to pause, stop, rewind this video because I'm going to go through the Unit 1 review page that you can find in your notebook on page 22 and that you're writing the answers on a blank sheet of paper. So as I review important concepts for the test, please follow along on your Unit 1 test review found on page 22 in your ISN. Remember, answers go on your notebook paper so that you can take that home to study, and then when you come back to class for the test, we'll tape that piece of paper in. And then you can always rewatch this video at home as it's linked in our Google Classroom. You can listen to it on your way to school. You can listen to it the day before the test, okay? So the first question is, how does science differ from other subjects such as art and history? As it states on page 10 in your ISN notebook, science differs from other disciplines such as history and the arts because it relies on testing evidence. So science is different because it relies on testing and gathering evidence. Okay. Question 2 asks you to list and briefly describe the steps of the scientific method. Again, this information can be found on page 10 of your ISN. And to go over that is when we start to think about science, we gather our observations using our 5 senses. But from there, the very first step in the scientific method is going to be to ask a question. From that question, we then conduct research using scientific journals. Then we develop a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an if, then, because statement, and it's testable, and it generally predicts what's going to happen in the experiment, and it helps to answer the question that you set first. So far we have step 1, question, step 2, research, step 3, hypothesis. From there, we get to do the fun part, which is our experiment, step 4. During the experiment, we're collecting data. Then we analyze the data in charts and graphs, and then we draw a conclusion. Once we draw a conclusion, then we report that information. So again, the steps are question, research, collect data. Question, research, hypothesis, experiment, collect data, analyze, conclusion, report. Question 3, it asks you to compare and contrast observation and inference and give an example of each. Again, this can be found on page 10 of your interactive notebook. And if we use observations, this is the act of noticing and describing events and processes in a careful way. Scientists use their observations to make inferences. So if you recall, when we looked at the mystery bag, we looked at that boy wearing a Texas jersey, our observations are based in facts, and we develop those facts using our 5 senses. So if we use the example of the boy wearing the Texas jersey, he had a Texas football jersey on, it was orange, he was holding a football. From there, our inferences are a logical, meaning they make sense, interpretation based on what scientists already know. For example, if we go back to the Texas Longhorns, we make the inference that Texas Longhorns are the boys' favorite football team. When we did the mystery bag lab, you might have said, well, if the bag is light, that would be your observation, and then your inference was it contains a cotton ball because it doesn't weigh a lot. All right, so what is the difference between independent and dependent variable? Be able to identify these variables in an experiment. So we've gone over this many times. It was our science starter a few times. We also looked at it when we were talking about charting data, okay? So independent variable is changed. So it is the one that is changed. The dependent variable is the one that is measured. Remember, measured, dependent with the D's. So if I was asking you the question, how does temperature impact the growth of bacteria? Temperature would be your independent variable because you'd be changing the temperature amounts, right? And then your dependent variable would be the bacteria growth because that is what you are measuring. Number 5 was a high miss question on the quiz that we took this week. So I want you to know this particularly. So how many variables change in a controlled experiment? In a controlled experiment, you change one variable. That variable is the independent variable. So the variable that is changed is the independent variable. And in a controlled experiment,
Larry, please come to the front office. Gary, please come to the front office.
In a controlled experiment, we change only one variable. Number 6 is, what is the purpose of a control group in an experiment? The purpose of a control group in an experiment is to compare the results of the experimental group to a control group. So you're comparing how the independent variable impacted a control group. So for example, if you were trying to grow plants and see how how light is impacting plant growth, your independent variable is the light. So your control group would be a plant growing in the dark. So you want to be able to compare how the light impacts to a plant compared to how a plant in the dark that's getting no light is impacted. 7, why is a universal measurement system important in science? Well, the universal measurement system in science is the metric system. So that's number 7. And number 8, what is the name of the universal measurement system used by science? It is metric system. And number 7, why do we use this? Is so that we can communicate with other scientists, right? So if we're using the metric system and we rely on science to do replication and repetition, and we want another scientist to replicate our procedure, they must be able to follow the same steps in order to get the same results. So we use a universal measurement system so that all scientists use the same information. Number 9, what are 2 types of data? Remember, we talked about this when we were graphing, and then also when we took notes. We have quantitative and we have qualitative. Quantitative with an N is number-based. Remember we did the Skittles and we did quantitative data. We might have counted and said we had 7 yellow. That would be quantitative data. The qualitative with the L is what it looks like. It's the adjectives that we use in observations and in data collection. So back to that Skittles lab, our qualitative data would be, it was circle, they had an S on it, they were colorful, they were round. So all adjectives that you are using in data are qualitative. It's what it looks like. Question 10, what are the types of graphs scientists use to analyze data? You can look at this information on your data collection notes that we took about how to graph and how to use the metric system. So there were 3 different types of graphs that we discussed. We discussed the line graph, the bar graph, and the pie chart. Line graph shows change over time. Bar graph is going to show comparing groups or percentages. And then pie charts show a part to whole and mainly are done in percentages in a circular graph. All right, compare and contrast a theory and a law and a hypothesis. We went over this on pages 11 through 13 in your interactive notebook. So to review, okay, a law is a rule that describes patterns in nature. For example, the law of gravity, law of motion, okay? It sometimes is written as a mathematical statement. On the other hand, a law is a logical explanation of why or how things work in nature based on observations and experimentation, okay? So they explain how and why things work for a theory. A theory is the atomic theory, the theory of evolution, the Big Bang theory, okay? Unlike theories in our everyday life, theories are accepted by scientists, but they are not set in stone, okay? So if new data or evidence is gathered, a theory might change. Now, theories and laws begin as a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a scientific explanation or guess, and it is mainly done by one scientist, one time, okay? Testing a hypothesis also often involves designing an experiment, and it's often tested in a controlled experiment with that one independent variable being changed. A law cannot become a theory, okay? And a theory cannot become a law. A hypothesis, through many tests and through repetition and replication, can become a theory or can become a law. If the hypothesis is describing a pattern, it's a law. If a hypothesis would describe how or why things work in nature, it would be a theory. Okay, so how does science impact society? This was the last lesson we did, and we talked about new discoveries in science are based, that help us in society make decisions. Right now we have COVID-19 going on. As new science is developed, we make changes in society. When we read the article and we divided our page into 3 sections, we learned how science helps us to understand animals and the environment, how it helps us to combat disease, it helps us to be healthy. It helps to make plastic. There's all these things that science does, but no, as new technology is gathered, science is going to change and ultimately society is going to be impacted. Okay, last 3 questions. So describe how science might change. Science changes when new evidence is gathered through observation or experimentation. So if new evidence is gathered, like when we did the sentences, right? When we gathered 5 words, then we gathered another 5 words and another 5 words. As we gathered our new evidence, science changed, our hypothesis changed. And this is true also in the everyday science. As we gather new information, our science is going to change. Okay, replication and repetition. We went over this on page 18 in our notebooks. It's when we did the baking soda and vinegar lab. So replication is when someone else copies the experiment. Repetition is when you redo the experiment. Both of these lead to the validation. Both of these validate your experiment in science. So once you do an experiment and you do it over and over and over again, repetition. But then if someone else does it, it's replication. This is why we have to have a universal measurement system. It's because if you do not, when you go to do replication, a scientist can't follow your procedure, remember your step-by-step process, and figure out and get the same results because you're not using language that everyone can understand. So replication, someone else does it. Repetition, you do it. And then finally, what are the advantages and disadvantages of model? Again, we went over this on page 13 in our notebook. Some advantages, it makes models and things in science more tangible, meaning we can understand them, we can touch them, we can see them better. They help us to notice patterns. They help us to devise or develop or revise things, and they helped us to predict events. A model is simply a representation of a real object or idea. So we use models to scale things down, like the solar system. It's too big to look all at once, so we scale it down. Sometimes we scale it up, right? So if we're looking at a cell, we make a bigger cell, so we're able to study it. And then if something's really complex, then we're able to study it that way as well. All right, so now I'm going to go over a few more important things to know for your test. It is 25 questions. It is all multiple choice. Okay, if you see something and you develop an idea, a question off of it, that is an example of you using observation and inferences. Okay, a theory, remember, A theory,
What do you want to be reminded
oh,
about?
when I said theory, Siri answered. A theory may be revised or replaced when you gather new evidence, okay? So scientific theories, okay, are a broad range of observations and hypotheses, and it helps to explain the natural world. A well-tested explanation that explains a lot of observation is a theory, okay? Remember, it's very important to be able to replicate, that you keep detailed records, okay? We talked about why the metric system is important. Remember, a theory is well supported by observations and experimental data. Science, remember, helps us to explain and understand and investigate the natural world. If we don't know why something happens, scientists should continue to gather information and learn as much as they can. They don't just give up, okay? When we start the scientific method, we start by developing a problem statement or question from observations, and then from there, we start to do research. Information gathered is called data. Remember that when you gather data is when you're collecting information, okay? If you suggest or make a prediction, it is a hypothesis and it should be tested. When we change something to test the hypothesis, that is your independent variable. Remember, models help us to better understand information. When new information is gathered, new technology, we're able to revise our scientific knowledge, be able to interpret the bar graph, the line graph, and the pie chart like we talked about. If a scientist conducts an experiment several times, it's repetition. Someone else does it, replication. Remember, a law tells us what happens under certain conditions and is written as a mathematical formula. When we do observations, we use our 5 senses, and our inferences are educated and logical. We use models to make predictions, okay. We measure the dependent variable, okay. I think you will do fine on this test. Watch this video again and go back, pause, make sure you have everything filled out on that unit test, okay? If you have any questions, raise your hand and I'll come help you.